Now, welcome, Pete, and thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Great pleasure.
Many of you, I think, will know of Pete, if not know him. He's a Norwich man, born in the city, and but he's also really, I think, a Renaissance man. You know, he's a poet, he's a broadcaster, he's a writer, and today we get him with his historian's hat on. Many of you will have read his earlier books, Norwich in the 50s, Norwich in the 60s in particular. But he's going to talk to us today about his latest book, which is a history of a unique local business, Jarrold's. And he will tell us really about the last 250 years. The shop and the business celebrated its 250th anniversary a couple of years ago. So I think that's as much as I need to say, except I should have introduced myself. My name is Michael Blackwell, and I help to coordinate the work of the Historians Group, which includes these monthly talks. So Pete, thank you very much for coming, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure. And how flattering to be described as a Renaissance man. That's the first time that's ever happened to me. I shall treasure it. Thank you. I'm a great fan of the Society, and hugely thrilled to be here today. So I'm now going to do that thing of sharing my screen to open the slides, which always causes a few moments of technological nervousness, but here we go. Jolly good. Can everybody see the slides? Okay, fine. So, yes, this is the story of Jarrold, if you will, 250 years now, strictly speaking, just over that. But let me take you through that in some speed. The founder is a man called John Jarrold. Now, you're going to hear me say a couple of things a couple of times today. One is that in the story of Jarrold, history does repeat itself, and you'll see what I mean by that as the talk goes on. Also, as imaginative and innovative as the Jarrold family have been, when it comes to forenames for their sons, they resolutely stuck to the idea of John. Even the men whose first name wasn't John became known as John. It gets a little bit confusing, but I will try and lead you through that. This John was born in 1745. He was orphaned by the time he was 12, at which point he was apprenticed to a man called Bridgman, who was a draper and operated a shop in Woodbridge. The young John Jarrold became a very serious boy, and we knew that he'd kept what used to be called a commonplace book. It's in many ways the holy grail of Jarrold artifacts, I suppose. We found that book, in physical terms, rather bigger than we thought. It's an extraordinary find. Some of it is little more than gossip, copied down correspondence, notes of the day. But also he wrote down his rules to being a good tradesman, which is quite something for a 12-year-old boy. Some of those rules were fairly obvious, sub-Shakespeare, neither a borrower nor a lender be, but some of them actually hint at what we now call customer loyalty. He actually talks about doing good by your customers so that you know they'll come back. He does work hard for Bridgman and settles into the life of learning the trade of retail. And it's in 1770 that he moves his own business. He'd become 21 in 1766. He'd inherited his grandfather's money by then. The Jarrolds had done things in business prior to all of this, but there's nothing really to speak of, except to say that John's grandfather had built up a reasonable amount of fortune, which this John now inherited. And in 1770, he opened a shop in Woodbridge as a bookseller and draper. He marries a lady called Elizabeth, and they have children. And for a moment in history there, it would seem nothing could go wrong, except it does. He only lives another 5 years. Now, at this point, something strange happens, and it is an instance of history will repeat itself. John dies. In truth, we're not sure why or how he died. There is some suspicion it was cholera, and the family weren't terribly keen on sharing that information. I've subsequently to the book coming out done a bit more research, and we now wonder if it was cholera. Certainly the symptoms listed indicate that. But by 1775, the poor man is dead. Elizabeth stays on for a couple of years. And then she does a rather strange thing. She leaves Woodbridge and comes to Norwich, but she brings with her only their son, John. The 4 daughters she leaves in Woodbridge in the care of friends and relatives. It's just a matter of record that she did it, but we have no reason why she only brought the boy with her. She lives in Norwich, not a particularly ostentatious life, but she lives with her parents. She survives until 1785, and then she dies just before the Christmas when, and here comes history repeating itself again, the young John goes to be an apprentice draper, just like his father had been, but he is sent to the splendidly named Obadiah Silcock in Stalham. At this point, John Jarrold II is leading a really rather unusual life. On paper, he's wealthier than the very kind man who is looking after him, but he hasn't yet attained the money he's due from his father and indeed mother's death. Elizabeth had left some money as well. By now, John's sisters, the 4 girls left in Woodbridge, have started to write to John, and you can probably imagine what they're asking. It's sort of, where's the money? John does everything he can to try and find why the money isn't forthcoming, and he talks to his mentor and boss, Mr. Silcock. Initially resistant to the idea of going to the law, John does actually hire a solicitor, a man called Cuffode, who also works out of Norwich and Woodbridge. Cuffode is determined to find out what's happened to the money, and he approaches Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper is one of the 2 key executors of John and Elizabeth's will, and he is a trustee. What Cooper has been doing is paying a few bills and occasionally sending a little bit of money, but the numbers never add up. And this young John Jarrold is an extraordinarily numerate young man. He can work with figures at an alarmingly fast speed. It doesn't add up, and he pursues the case. Cuffode gets Cooper arrested and hauled into court, but Cooper doesn't turn up in court. He sends a note to say he's too ill, which is kind of strange because he's actually seen in Norwich about 90 minutes after the court hearing. Eventually, Cuffode uses the sheriff's men, and they find Cooper's stagecoach on the Thorpe Road, heading out of Norwich on a Saturday evening in 1796. They stop the coach. Initially, they think there's nobody in it, but they soon see that it's Cooper hiding under some overcoats. They arrest him. Cooper says, unbelievably, given what's about to happen, he says, you can't arrest me now because if I don't go straight home, my wife will worry. The point is, Cooper has in fact embezzled the entire Jarrold fortune. He might be the executor, but he's far from honest. He's embezzled, stolen all of the money. And as a master criminal, he's failed spectacularly because as a fairly humble lawyer, he's actually managed to buy himself an enormous estate at Thorpe, just outside Norwich. So it's fairly obvious where the money for that had come from. To his credit, Cooper will behave well in the future. But by now, John is working for himself. He's learned a lot from Obadiah Silcock. And in 1797, with some signs of the money being recouped bit by bit from Cooper, he opens his own shop in Woodbridge. Now, I have to say at this point, I'm particularly thrilled by this, and I have to be honest, rather smug. This is the handbill that the 2nd John issued to announce the opening of his shop. There are 2 things about it that spring to mind. One is he refers there to having taken over the shop of a Mr. J.B. Taylor. Well, that's a typographical error. It's a spelling mistake. Taylor, T-A-I-L-E-R, as it says there, is a mistake. It should have been Taylor, T-A-Y-L-O-R. Once we know that, we know who that Taylor was. He was quite an active politician and campaigner. But here's the interesting thing. The shop that Mr. Taylor had was the shop that John Jarrold's father had had. No previous records had indicated this, but John Jarrold II had actually gone back into the shop that his father had founded in 1770. He'd taken down the name of Taylor, put the Jarrold name back up, and he begins to run a very successful business there. By 1805, he's frankly a little bored with being a retailer. He's made some money and he decides to move. This is a rather primitive little drawing, but it's one of the only ones we have. He moves to a farm in Dallinghoo on the Suffolk-Essex borders. He becomes quite a successful farmer. He also uses some of the buildings to do some printing. He writes various campaigning pamphlets. He settles into a reasonably successful but quieter life. And then this happens. In 1815, the Battle of Waterloo ends the war with France. Now, this might sound a bit strange, I'm sure, but when that war ended, the good news was there was peace. This will come as a surprise to you. It couldn't possibly happen, could it? But there was a problem because we'd not sorted out any trade deals with Europe, and we didn't know how to deal with the markets now that the trade deals were becoming far more important. The problem was that the minute the war ended, European corn could be imported into the UK at rock bottom prices. And for people like John Jarrold running a farm, the bottom just fell straight out of the market. It was perilous, an existential threat in effect. What happened was that John thought through what he was about to do, what he thought was his future, and what he does is this. He starts to concentrate more on writing and publishing and printing. So straight away we see some strands of the Jarrold legacy beginning to emerge. This is one of his pamphlets. He's actually got his signature on the top there. It's a pamphlet aimed at the general use of machinery and the threat it means for the working man. He's found how to run a printing press. He's worked out how to get printing done. He's organizing himself as a publisher. This is becoming a whole new world for him, but it's still a bit constrained and it's not producing the income that he's used to. He now has quite a sizable family. So in 1823, he moves to Norwich and he sets up as a printer and bookseller in Norwich. The address given is number 3 Cocky Lane. This is actually quite a problem for us historians. Finding out exactly where that front door was has proved very difficult. But suffice it to say, it's quite near London Street and what we now know as Little London Street. He sets up business in that shop and he takes with him to do it, and here's history repeating itself again, only one of his children. He takes John Jarrold, his son, but he leaves his other sons and his wife at Dallinghoo, certainly initially. The premises in Norwich, he's helped in finding those by his friend Obadiah Silcock. And you can see there that he sets out by selling all manner of printing and stationery and books at good prices, including music and musical instruments and copper plate printing. It's all going quite well. The family start to join him. Certainly the sons do. And here are the sons: John James, Samuel, William Pintling, and Thomas. John James is by far and away John's favourite son. They are very close, they get on extremely well, and John James is constantly the peacemaker in what is rapidly becoming a fairly tense family relationship. Thomas is a hardworking man. Samuel is hardworking, pious, and teetotal. William Pintling is no less hardworking, but he does like to travel, and he has an unerring habit of traveling straight into trouble. If he goes to France, there's a riot. He even manages to come home to Norwich on the night there's a riot. And his diaries are extant. And I use those diaries as a separate section of the book because they are illuminating. John James, John's favourite son, an incredibly hardworking man, actually dies young. He's died by 1840. So too has, in fact, he sorry, 1843. Prior to that, John's wife Hannah has also died. This leaves those three brothers, and by now those three brothers and their father are at total loggerheads. These men now live and work in the same building, but they communicate only in writing. Bear in mind, this is not an era of text messages and email. You have to sit down with a quill pen and an inkwell and write. They communicate only in writing. At the heart of their disagreement is the fact that John believes in a business that has low stock holding and high turnover. He believes in a business that expands itself using capital, and the brothers don't see it that way. Also, the late John James had tried very hard to get the company name changed to Jarrold and Sons, but although there seems to be some evidence that John had done that, it doesn't seem to work. The brothers come up with a plan. They hire a man called Tillett. Thomas Tillett is a rock star young lawyer in Norwich. He's got political aspirations. He's doing very well in the legal profession. And they hire Tillett to try and find out what is going on. To find out what's going on, they come up with a plan. It's breathtaking. They decide to organize it so that on one of the days when their father is out, as he does go traveling the countryside, they will actually steal the paperwork, the ledgers and the documents of their own father's business, their own business, and give them to Tillett so they can find out the true picture of the business. That's what they do. Tillett takes some time to go through those documents, and when he does, the answer isn't particularly pleasant. He finds out that John has done nothing legally to change the name of the company, and in fact, the brothers aren't, strictly speaking, even shareholders in the company. He finds out that the father has been spending money on property. He finds out that the promises made about stock taking and so on have never been kept. He does tell the brothers that they are culpable. It's a two-way street. As much as their father's been awkward, they've been somewhat remiss. The brothers decide to now run things differently. They will take equal salaries, they will commit to the business, and indeed they are successful in moving the company on. By 1848, for instance, they have a London office because the publishing wing is now becoming very strong, and they're publishing all sorts of books in fiction and fact and religious tracts. By 1849, Thomas is a witness at the trial of James Bloomfield Rush, the trial of the century in many ways. Rush has murdered Isaac Jermy, who is the recorder of Norwich. He is also the life president of Norwich Union. Rush's defense is very much a complicated business, and he leads his own defense disastrously. But he has used some fake pages, fake notes that have been left around the scene of the crime. And those pages have been torn from a notebook. Thomas is called as a witness on the Saturday of the trial. He's able to prove that the pages come from the book they found in Rush's bedroom. And he can do that because he knows that's a Jarrold notebook. And indeed, he was instrumental in making it. It was instrumental in the prosecution of Rush. A somewhat grisly fact, but Rush is eventually hanged in public from the outside of Norwich Castle, which means you could have probably just about seen it from the Jarrold store, which is quite a terrifying thought, really. And so we come to Black Beauty, staying inside the publishing wing. If you look at popular polls and charts of the most popular books for children, Black Beauty will still to this day appear in it. It's a complicated story and it's not entirely what it seems, but it is Jarrold who published Black Beauty, and it comes out in 1877. We think of Black Beauty quite rightly as being written by Anna Sewell, but actually Anna at the time was far less famous than her mother. Mary Sewell was a million-selling author. Dwell on that fact. We're talking about mid-Victorian England. Mary Sewell was quite a clever woman. She'd written several books. They are high Victorian sentimentality is a picture here of Mother's Lost Words, a story of three boys who will do anything in life to uphold their mother's last dying words. She'd been with a publisher who she felt was no longer giving her suitable exposure. She'd come across Samuel Jarrold through a mutual interest in the teetotal movement. She also knew that Samuel Jarrold was head of, or very much part of, the Jarrold publishing empire. So she approached Samuel, and Samuel passes the business on to Thomas, because it's Thomas who's very much germane to the publishing wing. Jarrold have done a very clever thing in taking on Mary Sewell. She becomes a hugely successful writer. And on one occasion, she is visiting Jarrold, her publisher. She's talking to the manager in London, and she asks him if he will take a look at this little book of her daughter's, Anna's idea, which she takes to Jarrold and lets them look at. Anna's little book is not at this stage conceived as a children's book. Anna is disabled. She'd been disabled in a riding accident as a teenager. She's already a middle-aged woman by now. She is passionate about the issue of animal rights, in particular cruelty to horses, and specifically the use of a thing called the bearing rein, which keeps the head of a horse upright. It's a cruel device. Black Beauty is a story about that. It's entirely to do with animal rights. But when Thomas Jarrold reads the little manuscript, he thinks it's a really good idea, and he takes it on. Jarrold take a long time to put this together. The initial forays by the sales force aren't terribly encouraging. I've personally looked at the correspondence, and there are some dreadful moments where some of the printing blocks get dropped and it has to be reworked. They're not quite sure at what price point to put the book out, but the book does evolve. And eventually, Jarrold realised, as we all do to this day, that nothing focuses the mind like a deadline. They decide that November the 24th, 1877 will be the date on which the book is published. And if you do any research, if you look around online, you will always find that as the date. The thing about that date is it's a Saturday. Jarrold retail staff have already been allowed time off on Saturdays by then, but the publishing staff don't. The office have been recently refurbished, and Thomas Jarrold is in the publishing office in London Street. He turns at the top of the stairs and has a seizure. He falls down the stairs. They take him to his home, and by early evening, he's dead. He never survives the day of publication of Black Beauty. Within a few months, Anna Sewell will be dead. In fact, very soon, nobody involved with the writing and publication of it will be alive. But the book goes on to take on an enormous new life. In fact, it's pirated by American publishers and printed by the million out there, not taking a penny into the Jarrold coffers. There is a bizarre and sad twist to this. On the day of Anna's funeral, it's a matter of record that her mother was seen to be looking out of the window as the hearse arrived and said out loud, "This won't do." When they looked, the horses drawing the hearse had a bearing rein, which I think is terribly sad. The undertaker was asked to remove it, which he did. By now, we have the fourth generation. These are Samuel's sons. There is a complication. The man on the left of the picture here, John, is Samuel's son by his first marriage. William and Herbert are his sons by his second marriage. The phrase wicked stepmother isn't one that I'd like to bandy around, but it has to be said that Samuel's second wife does not have much time for John. She wants William and Herbert in the business. The problem is that John is an incredibly hardworking man. Sorry, I know it's another John. He's actually called John James. That John is the first John Jarrold who will work in the business without being a director or a shareholder. He has no money in the business at all. He is in effect a hired hand, despite being the son of Samuel. He's so hardworking, he decides he really does need a part in the business, and he goes to an aunt who is a Jarrold. He takes out a mortgage, which is quite a big step for the time, and he does buy himself some shares into the business. But unfortunately, he dies quite young in 1890, and it leaves William and Herbert. As a researcher, historian, writer, I've got to be honest, initially, I wasn't prepared to like William and Herbert very much. They seemed to be men with a sense of entitlement and privilege, parachuted into this business with no real experience. Bizarrely, history repeating itself again, they'd been sent away to be apprentices, but they didn't have much experience. I've changed my mind. These two men really revolutionized the business, and they take the business on to a whole new level. They work very, very hard indeed. By the 1890s, Norfolk is now nationally, if not internationally, famous as Poppy Land. Jarrold is running a library. They're doing postcards, calendars, guidebooks. They're really beginning to be a multifaceted business, fueled very largely by the increasing fame of Norwich and Norfolk. But they're now becoming world famous. And so we arrive at the end of the 19th and very early 20th century. And by 1904, the original London Street frontage, this is a bird's eye view. We've commented on this the other day. Amazingly, for 1904, this giant store was still carrying a sign of ye olde bookie shoppy. It's time to change. The building is no longer really fit for purpose, and what's more, they want to put on a new image. So what can they possibly do? Well, they pull in George Skipper. They needed a famous architect, a high visibility architect, a successful architect, and ideally a local architect. And George Skipper ticked all of those boxes. He is remodeling London Street straight away. This picture shows Skipper's office. You will know it as part of the Jarrold building because it is. It's facing into Little London Street, or into London Street, sorry. But at the time, certainly in 1904, this was still George Skipper's office next door to the Jarrold building. Those reliefs on the building are very clever. The bylaws of Norwich at the time forbade architects from promoting their business on the outside of their buildings. George Skipper created these terracotta reliefs that show bricklayers and carpenters, seemingly as an Art Nouveau homage to craftspeople, but actually telling people he's an architect working in there. It's an astonishing building inside. It's got every known modern convenience, and he's right next door now to one of his major customers. The relationship is not good. Skipper is a mercurial character. He causes a lot of dissent in the relationship, and it's actually William Jarrold who writes to Skipper's brother to say, can you keep this man under control? That was quite an extraordinary thing to do. This was not really William's forte, and Skipper did not get on with his own brother. So it was an extraordinary correspondence. We don't know exactly what Skipper did to alienate the Jarrolds, but we've got some really quite good ideas, and I'm pretty sure some of them involved showing off and quite a lot to drink. But that building is now part of the Jarrold building, and indeed there is a George Skipper room inside there with artifacts relating to him. So it's Skipper who dramatically changes it. Here's one of Skipper's early drawings for the building. It shows pretty much what we know today. He does some interesting things. He uses architectural handwriting to denote what goes on inside the building. So there's a kind of literary allusion to the third floor where the book department was and has just moved back to. The newfound idea of window shopping has taken hold, and he's found a way of using thin pillars to create big windows. The one thing he doesn't get away with is that rather decorative tower on the top of the building. Jarrold thought it was a step too far, both in terms of ostentation and expense. Skipper didn't give up. He constantly pitched that idea, and he actually sold it to a bank somewhere elsewhere in Norwich, where he did finally get that idea implemented. But it's not on the Jarrold building, despite this charming little drawing. So by now, we've moved into Edwardian Norwich, and retailing is changing. I like this allusion to the history because it kind of shows just how innovative Jarrold were. There's a circulating library, but there's also that room there, which is almost like a prototypical internet cafe. It's got telegraph machines, it's got all the newspapers and magazines, and they really just say to business people, yes, just come in and have a coffee and read the papers and see the telegraphs, because they know that it will build what we today would call brand loyalty and brand awareness. So it really is a hugely modern step. And the store just grows and grows around those kinds of techniques. It's soon, of course, brought to a halt in a way by 1914. I say it's brought to a halt, but this is extraordinary. You'll all be familiar with the phrase, it'll all be over by Christmas. That picture is Christmas 1914. Look at the crowds outside, Jarrold. You wouldn't think there's a war on. Well, people weren't particularly involved. This wasn't a war of air raids and attack on the UK itself. This was an attempt to keep everybody happy. And by now, these hugely decorative catalogues of goods are promoting Jarrold in a way that, you know, is still used as a blueprint. This is almost a prototype for internet marketing. It's certainly a prototype for catalogue marketing, and you can see how it's spread into ladies' fashions, handbags, all manner of things. Between the wars, Jarrold take on the modernity you would expect a 1930s successful company to have. If you look at this advertisement, it's interesting. It's actually not the store. It's a picture of one of the great trade fairs at which they took part. They actually made a handbag for Queen Mary, who opened one of these great exhibitions and gleefully took the handbag from Jarrold. There's a lovely little side story to this. You can see there's some alarm clocks under the headline, All British Made. About early 1931, a lady wrote to the Eastern Daily Press challenging Samuel Jarrold to say, your advertisements say all your goods are all British made. I have been into your store and you have an alarm clock that's made in Germany. Please explain yourself. And Samuel wrote back through the pages of the Eastern Daily Press and said, yes, I do take your point. The point is British alarm clocks are very expensive and not very efficient. German alarm clocks are very cheap and very accurate. And many of our customers don't have the money that you obviously have to waste, so we are prepared to offer the right thing at the right price. Which I was rather proud of Samuel. Thought, well, that's you can't really beat that as a straight commercial argument, can you? It's Herbert's son who arrives next, John Jarrold. Again, this John Jarrold, who strictly speaking is called Herbert John Jarrold, he has several reasons to be important in the story. Firstly, he is now the first Jarrold to be on his own. He has no brothers or peers around him. He is taking on the company himself. He's witnessed his own father die whilst at work. He's been told he's got to pick up the reins, and he does. The other thing about this John is he's a scientist. He's not actually a bookseller or a publisher. He's a scientist. And one of the things that fascinates John to a level of almost obsession is the burgeoning emergence of the new 35mm transparency photography. John certainly learns the craft of printing very quickly, and he takes on the role of driving the company forward through printing. By the 1950s, he's already printing their own magazine, for instance. He's taken on all sorts of contracts. He develops the business. He takes on the mighty Harris. This is an American printing machine which can catapult Jarrold. It actually wasn't brand new. He bought this, as it were, one careful owner from America. And when he had it installed, he made a huge PR event out of it. He had the mayor and the local dignitaries there. But this catapults Jarrold into being a really, really top flight international printer. They're able to take on all sorts of work, and he still sticks to the 35mm transparency. Now, the point about the 35mm transparency is you can take out a small camera with 12 or even 36 photographs on it. Prior to that, you've got to take out a great big camera and shoot one at a time. If you're in the business of printing catalogues and brochures, you want a photographer to be able to move quickly and take lots of pictures. The problem was purists believed you couldn't produce or reproduce as well from a 35mm transparency as you could from the big pictures. John went to America, he worked with Kodak, he talked it through, and what he discovered was it wasn't the transparency that was the problem, it was the technology needed to convert the transparency to printing plates, and that's what he worked on, and he made it work, and it was revolutionary. So by the time his next generation comes along, we've arrived at a point where Jarrold are huge in the printing and publishing world. By now, Richard, who will take on the role of looking after retail, Peter will take on printing from his father, and Anthony will take on publishing. The dynamics of that have changed somewhat, and publishing is no longer books as it used to be, but I'll explain something about that as we go forward. In the meantime, back in Norwich, next door to the store, the Corn Exchange is up for sale. Now, this building had been there since the early 19th century. It's the building that gives the street its name, Exchange Street. It was no longer fit for purpose. It was about to be probably demolished, but the council couldn't bring themselves to do it. They put it up for sale. Jarrold wanted that building. They wanted it because they didn't want a competitor moving in next door. In truth, they weren't sure what they would do with it, but they needed that space and to protect their site, if you will, on Exchange Street. Eventually, after much toing and froing with the council, Jarrold buy the building, determined to expand their retail wing into it. On the day the sale went through, Richard Jarrold was in America. He was in a meeting with the managing director of the legendary New York store Macy's. And when I spoke to Richard about this, I think this is a truly lovely story. Richard said to me that he knew back in Norwich the solicitors were about to exchange the contracts on this building in Exchange Street. And in the conversation he was having, the managing director of Macy's said to him, well, you know, young man, the one thing you need to do now is expand out of the city centres. You don't want to be in town centres anymore. It's all about stores on the outskirts of town. And Richard thought, I think I've just made the biggest mistake in my life. He hadn't. It proved to be a very wise move, and the store grew and grew, including the fashion departments and escalators and all manner of things, including developments like this. This was by now the time of the boutique, the late 60s, early 70s, and Jarrold invented their own boutique inside the store. It was very successful. It was absolutely of its moment. I'm allowed to keep this picture in by personal permission of Caroline Jarrold, largely because it's a personal obsession. I love the pen counter in Jarrold, and I think if you are of a certain age and you come from Norwich, the chances are at least one, if not your first school fountain pen, came from the pen counter in Jarrold. And it's amazing how many people have got such fond memories of it. So there's a picture of it from the early 1960s with its Parker pens proudly displayed in their glass cases. By the 70s, the Jarrold family are very much ensconced into Norwich society. They always have been. They've been philanthropic, they've been societally aware. But in 1970, John Jarrold becomes mayor, and there is the family gathered on the City Hall steps as very much part of Norwich society. By the 80s and 90s, we now see these three big wings of the company taking a new shape. Printing, we've seen a massive investment. They're now printing magazines, and I'm talking about magazines such as Vogue and Good Housekeeping. This is big, big work. They're taking on book printing, holiday guides and brochures they've become enormous in, mail order and industrial catalogues. Those two last categories are important. The reason they're successful in that, you'll remember, I'm sure, the giant mail order catalogues of the 1980s. They are work that needs an incredible attention to detail. Some printers take on that work and fail at it. Some printers are too scared to even take it on. Jarrold are outstanding at it. And as such, they become to dominate that segment of the market. In retail, the ongoing investment in London Street is enormous. There's more building work. They take on fashion departments. They open up furniture departments. The restaurants and beauty departments now start to grow. They also develop the office equipment side of the business, which is still extant and is proving to be a very important wing. And in publishing, now it's different. It's calendars and postcards. It's huge. It's guidebooks. They are absolutely world leaders in guidebooks at this stage for all of the major attractions, and hardback books, including projects like Timpson's England, which would become a massively important seller. There's an interesting aside here that certainly in calendars and postcards, the earlier John would have been turning in his grave, because this was now about high inventory. There are sometimes 1 million postcards in stock because that's the size of the market, and Jarrold are massive in it. By the mid-90s, we've got a situation where the 6th, 7th, and indeed some of the, albeit tiny, 8th generation are all coexisting. And here's a picture of them at St. James's Mill in 1995. Sadly, some of those have now passed away, but it's a moment that captured 3 generations on the same steps. In 2003, a small but important event took place when Jarrold finally acquired the property that had been occupied for many years by Duns the tailors. This now, as it were, completed the jigsaw. Again, there's an irony here. Some of the money that John Jarrold II had been spending, he'd been spending on property, and in many ways, the ownership of freehold has enabled Jarrold to survive where other businesses who don't own their property have gone under. And this last little bit of the jigsaw, 100 or more years after his time, really locked together that corner of Norwich that they own and operate from. It was at this time that the Heritage Wall was constructed, as people began to realize that the story was worth telling. I was rather touched when I was in store the other day to see that my book and me have now been added to that, which is rather lovely, because we've moved on. But it has proved a real kind of tourist attraction. In store today, well, this of course is barely recognizable to a 19th century retailer, except in some ways it would be, because they still innovate, they still find new ways of putting merchandise in front of customers. This is drawing on the great traditions of people like Brooks Brothers and Harrods, certainly Selfridges, allowing customers to be in touch with products in a way that the Victorians could never have imagined. The beauty brands is worth mentioning because it is a significant step in the history of Jarrold and indeed retailing. This is no longer a world where a representative from Joe Malone or MAC Cosmetics turns up with a briefcase and asks Mr. Jarrold if he'd kindly sell their products. This is a world where Jarrold and other retailers have to prove themselves worthy of carrying those brands. It took Michelle Jarrold and the team 6 years to get MAC Cosmetics into Jarrold. But when you do get those brands in, it puts the store on the map, and it creates an enormous awareness of the kind of people who will shop there. In the female market, it's interesting. You now get granddaughters, daughters, and granddaughters, grandmothers, and mothers all shopping together, which is lovely because it's pulled the brands through. The in-store dining experience, well, Jarrold had started that very early. They'd had restaurants at the turn of the 20th century. You'll find loads of lovely memories of people from mid-20th century determined to have the corner seat and the window seat to dine. But they've expanded into different kinds of restaurants in different parts of the store. This is now a world of the so-called retail experience, and Jarrold have been outstanding at that. The delicatessen was a huge step. Nobody had done such a thing as this. It's almost like a slice of New York in the basement of Exchange Street. Was it risky? Yes. Has it been a success? Most certainly. It's already hugely popular. Branches and premises are still around. The dynamic has changed, but it's still an empire in terms of retail. inevitably, Jarrold have had to go online. But this isn't just a store with a website. When Jarrold went online, they did it properly and have now built an extremely robust online business. The pandemic, of course, altered the dynamic of online shopping. Suddenly it became the only way you could shop. So it changed things. But even that aside, the use of online shopping is very robust now. Always involved with Norwich City, but I tend not to dwell on Norwich City just at the moment. Event marketing, as it's known in the trade. Events are important. I mean, I myself have had book signings in Jarrold. This is a great way of engaging people, and there are famous people who will engage with evenings and events at Jarrold, and they're hugely popular in the customer base. Things like the Ladies' Day at Fakenham Races became very much part of the Norfolk calendar. Brand new developments, the Bay, the seafood restaurant, the refectory at the cathedral is a Jarrold restaurant. I think it's absolutely splendid place to be, and it's another indication of how Jarrold have altered over time. Own labelling, well, there are two ways of doing that. You can either make it cheap and cheerful or very stylish, and Jarrold have launched an extremely stylish range of own label products, and it's proved very, very popular. People literally ship this stuff all over the world because it says so much about the store in the city. Property development now emerges as a very, very important part of the Jarrold empire, and in many ways it's probably the biggest part. St James's Place, you know, there are companies like Mills and Reeve and Grant Thornton, Virgin Wines, Barclays Bank. They've all got property there that they rent from Jarrold Property Development. Wensum Housing provides social housing at Blackfriars and Duke Street, which is another part of the Jarrold Property Development. St James's Mill, I could have done a whole other talk simply on St James's Mill and Whitefriars. It's central to the Jarrold empire. It's where a lot of the printing's been done. Jarrold bought it, sold it, bought it back after World War I, developed it again. It's an integral part of Norwich history. It's linked to the printing business and the textile business. It's got a checkered history, but it's very much part of Jarrold, and it still sits there at the core of the property development. The Jarrold Bridge, very much Peter Jarrold's idea, a bequest to the city. If you see it from the air, it's in the shape of the Jarrold J, and it links the two sides of the city over the river. It was an extraordinary generous gift, opened with a fanfare specifically commissioned for it. And you can see there that mixture of the old Victorian buildings and the new buildings as part of the property development. Today, Jarrold Business Services provides all sorts of things, training, based in St James's Mill, business skills training. There are facility management organisations which offer security and cleaning services, software training. It's a huge organisation. In terms of community involvement, philanthropy and Jarrold have been synonymous for 200 years. But here, today, the Community Foundation, there is heavily involved with the Norfolk and Norwich Festival, the Philharmonic Society, very early investors in the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts and the UEA, the John Innes Centre, the Forum Trust, Dippy, the dinosaur, heavily involved with him. Heritage Open Days are important. There was a massive charity investment around Jarrold 250, and it was very successful, donating to each and the Printers Trust and the Norfolk Cancer Trust. There is this, which I always mention specifically, the John Jarrold Trust, set up by Peter Jarrold in honour of his father, established in 1965. The John Jarrold Trust gets income from a massive tranche of shares that Peter Jarrold had set aside so that their income always went to charitable purposes. Over £4 million have been distributed so far. Typically, it's for community arts and education projects. Over 150 causes are supported every year, and it does extraordinarily good work. This is a little, and I think very pleasant shot of St James's Mill, which really does look splendid on that day. These are the celebrations. I don't know if anybody saw the man who walked across the tightrope across the city as part of the celebrations for 250 years. It was breathtaking, really, but just part of a massive celebration. And there indeed is the book, on its launch day in the Jarrold book department, astonishingly now, 2 years ago. So the book is called Jarrold 250 Years by me. Stephen Fry kindly wrote a very generous foreword. You can buy it in Jarrold, in store, and you can order it online at www.jarrold.co.uk, which really for the moment only remains for me to say thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed that rather breakneck pace rush through 250 years, but I think it's an interesting story about a fascinating company from our really rather wonderful city. Thank you for listening.
All right. Well, that was a super interesting talk.
Thank you very much.
I really didn't know the extent of this major business. One question that has come in is how has Jarrold's department store retained its name and independence when Bonds and Curls and other big department stores got taken over by conglomerates?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there are 2 or 3 answers to it. One, a tenacious and ferocious attitude towards being independent. History does show that there have been overtures made from some of the bigger groups, and they have been resisted. But I think at the heart of it is the ownership of property. The companies who've had to succumb to being part of a big group have done so because it was the only financially sensible model for their future, because they don't own the property and the bills and the rates and the rent and the mortgages are too high. But Jarrold are so independent, and they've had other strings to their bow. So they have managed to retain that independence. And it's a great point you make. There are 2 or 3 other examples. There's a splendid store in Newcastle. There's one in the south that have done the same thing. And typically it's because they are companies of great longevity who have held on to their property and ownership of their property, which has given them a stronger financial model. But I think that's the key to it, really.
Mm-hmm. We've had one question in saying, can you say a bit about the printing museum?
Yes, I can. The printing museum has now moved. It's up at, how embarrassing. It's up in North Norfolk. It was housed down at the mill for many years, but all sorts of reasons it's had to move along. It's a terrific collection of printing materials and artifacts. I find it personally upsetting that some of the things in the museum actually date from the time when I started work, which is deeply, deeply hurtful. But the details are all available online, and I do urge people to take a look and have a look. I think it's at Holcombe now. It's really worth a visit, but you do need to check because opening times and availability are still, I think, under discussion as they get themselves sorted out in their new premises. But it's a great opportunity to see a lot of artifacts related to printing and printing in general, as well as the Jarrold business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how do you see the future of the company?
Well,
the issues that they discuss about the future?
I think he's got a great future, partly because of the reasons we've already been discussing, partly because they've never failed to embrace change and the necessity to change, and they've always stayed one jump ahead, if you will, really. Plainly, these are deeply worrying times for anybody in retail. Jarrold are no longer printers, they're no longer publishers, but they are property developers, so there is plainly a future in that, and they are still very successful retailers. And I think that retail wing will continue because there will always be a place for that retail experience. It might change in terms of what we require from a retailer. We may want to buy some things online from them, as well as go in store to feel and touch things. But I mean, you know, what book lover isn't prepared to occasionally buy a book online, but you really want to go and see it and touch it, don't you? Same as trying on clothes and so on. So I think the retail wing will continue, and I think it will be at the heart of Norwich as it's been for these 200 and more years. So I'm convinced it will remain a successful company, but plainly it will change because all businesses are having to change now more than ever, I think.
Okay, an anonymous attendee has posted that the printing museum is at Blickling.
Blickling, I beg your pardon, I said Holcombe, didn't I? Of course, sorry, yes.
And final question is, why did they give up the printing side?
Oh, okay. The printing side was housed in the Whitefriars premises. Those premises were becoming unfit for purpose in a way. You could no longer get the kind of transport in and out you needed to, and you needed different machinery to go to the next level. That would have required a level of investment that was existential in terms of the threat to making that step. They decided, therefore, that it probably wasn't for them, but a group of employees and other backers decided that they would like to take the business on. And so Jarrold sold the business to them, helping them along by offering a reduced rent on the same premises whilst it got up and running. Sadly, that business didn't survive itself for very much longer because it succumbed to all sorts of pressures hitting the printing industry at the time. But Jarrold had stepped away from it by then. So they were no longer publishers either. The relationship between being a publisher and a printer is something that had cropped up twice in Jarrold's history. Publishers don't like publishers are also printers, and printers don't like printers are also publishers. It's a curious relationship. If anybody had made success of it, Jarrold had, but it had become increasingly complicated, and so the business dynamic, the business model had changed. But yeah, they stepped away from printing because it was no longer practicable from their business model in those premises. But it did carry on under the name for some time under different ownership.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Pete, for the talk, which was, as I said before, which was fascinating. And when I actually emerge from the pandemic hibernation and go shopping in the city centre again, I shall never go in Jarrold's in the same way as I used to.
I don't. I've got a lot of ghosts to meet me when I go in there now. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Okay, well, very many thanks.